September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The surrender has been signed. On the deck of the USS Missouri, cameras capture MacArthur's stern face, the Japanese delegation's humiliation, the moment the war officially ends. But 2 miles away, on a dock in Yokohama, something else is happening that no photographer thinks to record. A young Japanese dockworker, his city still smoking from B-29 raids, his stomach hollow from years of rationing, watches as American soldiers unload vehicles from a transport ship. Not weapons, not food, just jeeps, hundreds of them, thousands of them. An endless river of identical olive-drab machines rolling off the ships like water, parking in perfect rows that stretch beyond his vision. He has spent 4 years being told that Japan's warrior spirit would overcome American materialism. He has believed, with the fervor of the desperate, that discipline and sacrifice would triumph over decadence and abundance. But now, standing in the ruins of his country, watching this mechanical tide that seems to have no end, he understands with terrible clarity that Japan never had a chance. Not because American soldiers fought better, not because American generals were smarter, but because America had so many of these machines that they could simply throw them away. His hand trembles as he lights a cigarette, American, given to him by a GI who had a whole carton and offered one like it was nothing. Around him, jeeps keep coming off the ships. He counts 20, 50, he stops counting. They just keep coming. And in that moment, he grasps the true horror his nation faced. They had gone to war against a country that treated vehicles like these, each one a miracle of engineering by Japanese standards, like disposable napkins. This is the untold story of the Second World War's aftermath, not the story of treaties or trials, but the story of 647,925 machines that America scattered across the planet like seeds and then simply walked away from. Because when the shooting stopped, the United States military found itself with more jeeps than most countries had total vehicles, sitting in depots on every continent, still running, still useful, and utterly unwanted. The story of what happened to these abandoned ambassadors of American power is the story of how a nation accidentally colonized the world not with soldiers or politicians, but with four-wheeled machines so indestructible that some are still running 80 years later. This is the story of the invasion that never ended, the quiet conquest that taught the entire planet to think like America, one rebuilt engine at a time. In April of 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed and Allied armies raced toward Berlin, a logistics officer named Captain Robert Morrison sat in a commandeered German warehouse in Aachen, staring at a spreadsheet that made his head hurt. The numbers were absurd. In the European theater alone, the United States had 183,000 jeeps. The war in Europe was effectively over. The Pacific Campaign was entering its final phase. And someone, somewhere up the chain of command, had just asked him the question that would define the post-war world: what the hell are we going to do with all these jeeps? Morrison had done the math. Shipping them back to America would require 9,150 cargo vessels, just for the jeeps, not counting the millions of tons of other equipment scattered across 2 oceans. The fuel cost alone would exceed $40 million. In 1945 dollars. The time required would delay the return of soldiers by months, maybe years. And even if they somehow pulled off this logistical miracle, then what? Dump 650,000 military vehicles onto the American market and watch the Ford Motor Company collapse? Every option was impossible. Every solution was absurd. So Morrison, exhausted and pragmatic, wrote a recommendation that would reshape the global order, suggest transfer to Allied forces or declare surplus and abandon in place. 5 words that would change everything: abandon in place. But nobody understood yet what those words would mean. Nobody imagined that these abandoned machines would become the template for American global dominance, the Trojan horses that would carry American industrial philosophy into every corner of the planet, the teachers that would instruct 3 generations of mechanics in the American way of thinking about machines, efficiency, and power itself. The German soldier in that ruined town, the one who touched the warm hood of the Jeep with trembling fingers, represented something American planners hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just defeated. He was converted. For 4 years, Wehrmacht mechanics had performed miracles with inadequate resources, keeping vehicles running with hand-fabricated parts, with improvised solutions, with genius born of desperation. A German truck that broke down in Russia in 1943 might require parts manufactured in Stuttgart, shipped through hostile territory, installed by a specialist who understood that specific model's unique engineering. The repair could take weeks. The German mechanic had learned to be an artist, because only artistry could keep the machines alive. And then this same mechanic encounters a Jeep, examines it with professional curiosity, and discovers something that seems almost insulting in its simplicity: every part is interchangeable. The carburetor from a Jeep built in Toledo in 1942 fits perfectly into a Jeep built in Detroit in 1944. No modification needed. No specialist required. Any mechanic with basic training can perform the repair in 20 minutes. The German's initial reaction is contempt: such loose tolerances, such crude engineering. But then he watches American motor pools, sees the speed of their repairs, sees the efficiency of their logistics, and the contempt curdles into something else: respect, fear. The understanding that Germany had lost the war not on the battlefield but in the design philosophy of vehicles like this one, machines built not for perfection but for multiplication. This psychological transformation, repeated in the mind of every Axis mechanic, every Allied engineer, every colonial administrator who encountered American equipment, was the Jeep's first victory in the post-war world. It taught a lesson that propaganda never could. American power wasn't based on superiority but on abundance. Not better, just more. So much more that more became its own form of better. When the surrender documents were signed and the occupation began, nobody officially decided to leave the Jeeps behind. The decision emerged organically, made by 10,000 individual officers facing local circumstances. In the Philippines, an army major looked at his motor pool, 300 Jeeps, all functional, all maintained, and received orders to prepare for return to the States. But the shipping allocation he received would allow for 50 vehicles. He spent a week trying to figure out what to do with the other 250, ran the numbers on leaving them in storage, and finally just sold them to the new Philippine Army for $1 each and filed the paperwork as transferred to Allied nation. In North Africa, entire depot complexes full of Jeeps were simply abandoned when American forces withdrew, locked behind chain-link fences with a single guard who eventually wandered off because nobody was paying him anymore. In Germany, a pragmatic colonel looked at 4,000 Jeeps, looked at the devastated German economy desperate for any kind of transportation, and organized an auction that sold military vehicles to German civilians for less than the cost of a decent meal in New York. Nobody told him to do this. Nobody stopped him. The Jeeps just flowed outward from American control into the wider world, like water seeking its level, finding the places where they were needed because they were there and available, and America had so many that their loss didn't even register. By 1947, just 2 years after the war's end, surplus Jeeps had appeared in 87 countries. Not through any Marshall Plan provision. Not through official military aid programs, though those would come later. Just through the sheer overflow of American production, the spillage from a war machine so vast that its leftovers could equip most of the planet. A farmer in rural France, his land still pocked with shell craters, could buy a Jeep at a surplus auction for 10,000 francs, about $100, and suddenly owned a machine that could plow, haul, transport, that could transform his economic prospects in ways that would have required years of saving before the war. He didn't think of it as American power or soft imperialism. He thought of it as luck, as opportunity. But every time he needed a replacement part, he ordered from an American supplier. Every time he had a mechanical question, he consulted an American manual. Every time he thought about upgrading, he looked at American options because that's what he knew, what he trusted, what was compatible with the infrastructure he'd already built around this machine. Multiply him by 100,000, across 50 countries, and you begin to understand how the Jeep conquered the world without firing a shot in anger. In the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, Red Army officers faced the same surplus problem as their American counterparts, but with a different ideological overlay. Soviet forces had received 51,000 Jeeps during the war through Lend-Lease, and Soviet soldiers had loved them with an intensity that worried political commissars. The Jeep represented everything communism was supposed to provide but didn't: reliability, simplicity, abundance. Soviet trucks broke down constantly, required specialist repairs, came from factories that produced each model slightly differently. The Jeep just worked. When the war ended, Soviet commanders tried to keep every Jeep they'd received, and Soviet engineers were ordered to develop a domestic equivalent immediately. The result was the GAZ-67, a vehicle that Soviet propaganda insisted was a wholly original design developed from superior socialist engineering principles. Soviet mechanics who had worked on both knew better. The GAZ-67 was a copy, modified just enough to save face, built in quantities that seemed impressive until you remembered that America had built 12 times as many Jeeps in the same period. But the real revelation for Soviet engineers wasn't the design, they could copy that. It was the production method. American factories built Jeeps with interchangeable parts because American industry had learned to machine with tolerances so precise that randomness disappeared. Soviet factories, even with German machinery seized as reparations, couldn't match those tolerances. Soviet Jeeps required hand-fitting of parts because Soviet industry was still fundamentally artisanal, not industrial in the American sense. The Jeep had revealed a gap that no amount of ideological determination could bridge. The Soviet Union could copy the design but not the system that made the design powerful. In Japan, the revelation cut even deeper. Japanese engineers before the war had been world-class, building aircraft and ships that matched or exceeded American equivalents in individual performance. But Japanese manufacturing had been built on the German model, small batches, high precision, expert craftsmanship. The Zero fighter was magnificent, but Japan built 10,000 of them during the entire war. America built 300,000 aircraft in the same period. Japanese trucks were well designed, but Japan produced 165,000 vehicles total during the war. America built 2.4 million. The Jeep, in its unglamorous utility, represented the philosophical gap. When American occupation authorities put Japanese mechanics to work maintaining Jeeps for the occupation forces, those mechanics approached the job with their traditional perfectionism, checking tolerances, carefully fitting parts, taking pride in precise work. American supervisors told them to work faster. The Japanese mechanics explained that rushing would reduce quality. The Americans explained that the Jeep was designed for good enough, not perfection, and that speed mattered more than excellence. This conversation, repeated in 1,000 workshops across occupied Japan, was the beginning of a revolution. Japanese engineers began to understand that American success wasn't despite their seemingly crude tolerances but because of them. That American industry had discovered something profound: perfect was the enemy of enough. That you could build adequate things so quickly and so abundantly that adequacy became overwhelming. This lesson, absorbed and perfected, would transform Japan from defeated enemy to economic superpower within a generation. Toyota's production system, Honda's manufacturing philosophy, Sony's approach to consumer electronics, all carried the ghost of lessons learned from the Jeep. Japan took American industrial logic and, with characteristic discipline, made it better than America itself. But it was in the developing world, in nations that had never been industrial powers and never expected to be, that the Jeep's impact became most strange and most profound. In 1948, a surplus Jeep arrived in a village in Kenya, purchased by a British colonial administrator from an army depot in Nairobi. The village had never seen a motorized vehicle before. The nearest road was 40 miles away. The administrator used it to travel between his station and the regional capital, and the sight of this machine, moving without animals, carrying loads that would require a dozen men, traveling distances in hours that took days on foot, was more than practical. It was metaphysical. It challenged every assumption about distance, time, effort, possibility. Young men from the village learned to maintain it, learned that machines could be understood and controlled, learned that technology wasn't magic but applied knowledge. When Kenya gained independence in 1963, one of those young men had become a mechanic, trained entirely on that one Jeep and its eventual replacements. He opened a repair shop in Nairobi that serviced vehicles across East Africa. He trained apprentices who opened their own shops. By the 1980s, the network of mechanics he'd founded, all tracing their knowledge back to that first Jeep, employed over 2,000 people. One vehicle, cascading across time, creating an entire skilled workforce that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Multiply that story by 10,000, across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and you see the pattern. The Jeep didn't just provide transportation. It provided education, a curriculum and applied engineering taught through necessity to anyone willing to learn. American military manuals for the Jeep, translated into dozens of languages, became textbooks. Men who'd never attended formal school learned to read from those manuals because they needed to understand the diagrams. They learned mathematics calculating gear ratios and fuel consumption. They learned metallurgy understanding why certain parts failed and how to replace them. The Jeep was a university that traveled to places universities would never reach, teaching practical skills that created economic opportunity in regions that had none. And everywhere these Jeeps went, they carried with them an implied lesson about American civilization. This was a nation with so much wealth, so much productive capacity, that it could build 650,000 of these machines for a single war and then just abandon them when the war ended. Every mechanic who repaired a Jeep, every farmer who used one, every soldier in a newly independent nation who patrolled and won, learned that lesson. America was rich beyond comprehension, rich enough to be wasteful, rich enough that its trash was treasure. This understanding did more to establish American dominance than any treaty or military base. It created a global assumption of American superiority that was based not on propaganda but on material evidence visible in every town that had a Jeep. You couldn't argue with it. You couldn't resist it. It was simply there, this four-wheeled testament to American power, running year after year after year, never quite dying, always reparable, a permanent reminder of what America could do when it decided to make something. By 1955, the dispersal was complete. Of the 647,925 Jeeps built during the war, approximately 18,000 remained in American military service. Another 30,000 had been destroyed, scrapped, or lost. The remaining 600,000 were scattered across the planet in one of the largest, unintentional redistributions of technology in human history. They were everywhere and nowhere, invisible because they were ubiquitous, forgotten because they were functional. In Brazil, they carried coffee beans from plantation to port. In Turkey, they patrolled borders. In Australia, they herded cattle across stations the size of European countries. In India, they became rural buses, their back beds fitted with benches, carrying a dozen people at a time along roads that barely existed. In Iran, they pumped oil fields. In Thailand, they transported rice. In Morocco, they were taxis. They had become, without anyone planning it, the default vehicle of the mid-20th century, the mechanical standard against which all other utility vehicles were measured. And they kept running. This was the final insult, the ultimate demonstration of American industrial philosophy. A Jeep built in 1943, used hard during the war, sold as surplus in 1946, would still be running in 1965. Not pampered, not carefully preserved, but used daily, maintained by people who'd learned their skills from translated manuals and improvised solutions. The Jeep forgave incompetence, tolerated abuse, survived neglect. It was the Model T of the post-war era, and like the Model T, its true significance wasn't its engineering but its accessibility. Anyone could own one. Anyone could fix one. And in running forever, in refusing to die, in constantly reminding the world of its origins, the Jeep made America inescapable. There's a Jeep still running today in a village in Madagascar. It was built in 1944, shipped to the Pacific, used in the Philippines campaign, sold as surplus in 1947, somehow made its way through a dozen owners across 3 continents, and now carries produce to market twice a week. Its engine has been rebuilt 11 times. Its body panels have been replaced with hand-formed metal. Its electrical system is mostly improvised. Of its original 10,000 parts, perhaps 200 remain. But it's still a Jeep, still recognizable, still embodying that American idea that things should be simple enough to fix, common enough to find parts for, and tough enough to outlast the civilization that built them. That Jeep, and the 600,000 others scattered across the planet, are America's most successful export. Not democracy, not capitalism, not culture, but this, the idea that abundance, not excellence, is the true measure of power. That the nation that can afford to throw away its miracles will inherit the earth.